Tonight we want to take a look at the book of Esther. And this is a book that is unique in all of the Bible, partly because it straddles one of the great moments in military history. The Battle of Thermopylae occurred when a Greek force of approximately 7,000 men held off more than 150,000 fighting soldiers of the Persians, and they did it in a small 20-yard wide pass. From that, you might know that King Leonidas of Sparta led the defending Greeks, and when he realized he was actually surrounded, he sent away the bulk of his troops, and he had 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and all of them fought to the death. And from that, Hollywood made the movie 300 back in 2006. Now, that stands right around the opening of the book of Esther. Esther is a response to a black eye gotten by Xerxes or Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus. So one of the greatest moments in military history is sitting right on top of that. That might require a closer look. So let me just do a little bit of what was in the news back at the time of chapter 1 of Esther as you open up. And we'll try to use that to kind of introduce the book. Before we study the book, I want you to think about Herodotus and the early historian that provided us with newspaper headlines on what was going on in the background. It all started 2 decades before Esther chapter 1 with a revolt in what is now Western Turkey, or what was then called the Ionian states, and it was backed by the Athenians. The Athenians didn't like the Persians taking over areas they had once had. So the Athenians backed a revolt on the western edge of Persia, which is today modern Turkey, and actually incited a revolution. Darius I, the king, found out that the Athenians were feeding into his own kind of insurrection on his edges of his territory, so he vowed that he was going to go and get the Athenians and bring them to his chair, and they were going to kneel before him. Bottom line is all of that happened around 500 BCE. He swore revenge on Athens, but he really didn't get it. He crushed the Ionians, but then he put down the revolt in Miletus and he marched on Greece. And there's a battle that some of you know in 490 called the Battle of Marathon. The Battle of Marathon was set at the end of August, beginning of September. It's hot in Greece in August and September. And Darius sent a naval task force that took on the Cycladic Islands and wiped out a lot of the offenders on those islands. But then he finally wanted to march on Athens itself. He landed north of Athens in Marathon. And when he did that, he wanted to meet the Athenians marched up to Marathon to meet the Persian advance and stop them from coming into the city of Athens. And so they sent these Athenian hoplites to go out and take on these Persians. And when they did that, they devastated the Persian infantry. They were outmanned, they were outgunned, but the Athenians knew the landscape and the terrain, and so they whooped them. Well, Darius was in no way ready for that. By the way, you know about this story. This is that kind of weird story. Theodipides runs away from the battle all the way 26 miles from Marathon all the way to Athens, and we get the term marathon from this. He dies when he says that the Athenians have been victorious. Darius vowed, after he pulled in his, took his little red wagon and went back home, Darius vowed, I'm coming back and I'm going to clean out these Athenians. They have embarrassed me, the great king of Persia. The problem was he was preparing to do that, and Egypt went into a revolt because they thought, well, if the Ionians can do it, we can do it too. And he went to fight against the Egyptians, and he died in 486. His son, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, took over. I told you that whole story only to make one point. His son came into the job, put on the crown, but he had a chip on his shoulder. With the crown on his head and a chip on his shoulder, he decided he was going to make good on his dad's old problem. He was going to form the largest army that had ever been formed, and he was going to take his Persian army and march all the way back to Athens and clean that place out. To do that, Esther chapter 1 says he threw a really huge party. to get all of the military to come to see how incredibly glorious he was, because some of them didn't believe after his dad got whooped that maybe they were quite as strong as they thought they were. So Esther chapter 1 is set in an attitude. It's people coming together. Now what's interesting to me is that Esther chapter 2 is after the battle. What happened in the battle? Well, Xerxes decided after Esther chapter 1 and the big party that they would put together this plot. They marched back to Athens. They were going to take it. And that's when he found himself up against a much smaller force that held him off for several days. And the Battle of Thermopylae occurred, and the battle that we call the Battle of the 300. It's interesting because even after the Greeks lost their men, even after he was able to come into Athens, the Athenians were smart. They evacuated their town before the Persians got there. Xerxes' army found an empty downtown. Where were the people? They put them all on light ships and took them out to Salamis out in the Saronic Gulf. And as they were moving around in the Gulf on these light ships, the Persians had an opportunity to burn Athens down, to take over the city, to populate it with their own people, and they thought, no. We're going to get those Athenians. We're going to put them in the bottom of the sea. We are really ticked at the way that they've beat us in the past, so we're going to make this right. They chased them. But the big Persian ships were no match for the little Athenian ships that outmaneuvered them. And by the time it was over, this massive army, 1 million strong, including all of the people that brought supplies back and forth, and 150,000 on the front lines, were cleaned out and were beaten by the Athenians yet again. Xerxes comes back, and in chapter 1, in his big party, he lost his queen. But between chapter 1 and chapter 2, it says, in the beginning of chapter 2, after these things, there were quite a few things that it was after. Quite a few Athenians just whipped quite a few Persians. And now he's back, and chapter 2 begins with a guy who's depressed, without a queen, and feeling really bad about himself. So it sits right on top of this incredible moment in history. You know, what I think is interesting is that we know in the book that Esther was taken to Xerxes in December of 479. We know that he was whooped in 480, so it's a year later. We know that he's hurting over his situation. Now, there's something else about the book that's a little bit unique. If I were going to set a theme over the book of Esther, it would be this: God's sovereign preservation of his people, even when they're wayward, and his establishment of a feast called Purim. What's interesting to me is the book is unusual because the name of God is not mentioned in the book, and prayer is never overtly mentioned in the book. They're in the middle of a crisis in this book, and you will see fasting, but you'll see no specific word of prayer. You'll see no specific reference to the God of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob at all. It is set among people who frankly are not following the law. These are Jews not doing right. If you read it closely, you have to have your eyes on and see it from a Jewish perspective. Mordecai, for instance, is found in Esther chapter 3. On the 13th of Nisan, he is in Susa. Well, on the 14th of Nisan, he should be in Jerusalem observing Passover. These people are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So don't color Esther and Mordecai as upstanding, godly people. There's a reason why Mordecai doesn't have a problem with Esther entering a sleep one night with the king pageant. These are not people who are following God's law, but they are God's people. And God is preserving not just the people that are wayward, but he's preserving the Judean Jews where Messiah will come. Because if Haman gets his way, they won't just kill the Jews of Susa, they'll kill the Jews of Jerusalem as well. And then it's game over. So God is preserving, even through wayward people in the book that aren't praying, that aren't doing the feast, that aren't keeping the law properly, God is preserving his people. I think what's interesting is that the story itself is laid out over 10 chapters. And the easiest way to divide it is the first 2 chapters set up the background of the people in the story. So I just put people in my first box, chapters 1 and 2. And then chapters 3 through 8 is sort of the plot line of the book. Haman attempts to have all of the Jews killed, and he puts forward this idea through a complex plot, and God thwarts what he's doing, even though the players themselves, Mordecai and Esther, are not sure that that's the way it's going to play out. Then the last part in chapter 9 is really the remembrance of Purim, what the feast of Purim is and how it came about. And chapter 10 is just 3 little verses on, and by the way, Mordecai got his name written in some pretty important periodicals of his day, and he got some accolades, and things went well for Mordecai. A good time was had by all. Kind of a nice ending. Now, I want you to go to chapter 1 for just a minute, because the opening chapter sets up one of the great pictures of a bad decision made by a drunken, plotting king who's got a chip on his shoulder and a crown on his head. He's got a problem. Before his defeat, he's walking in arrogance. He honestly believes that his father got whooped by the Athenians, but he won't. So he makes some terrible choices. And chapter 1 is really, how did he get into the mess? I see 4 component ingredients to how to make an absolute mess of something, or how to go from riches to ruin, because that's what he's going to do. And the first one in the first 6 verses is personal pride. Look at the opening verse, and it says that Ahasuerus or Xerxes ruled from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. You can hear the regality of it, right? Here's the bottom line. The problem with focusing on fame is that life is short. Positions don't last. And putting your hope in them is a fool's errand. So you open up with his position and his personal pride based on his fame, but then you move to his personal pride based on his power. He holds a banquet, verse 3 says, for all his princes and attendants, army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles, the princes. Verse 4 says he displays the riches of his glory and the splendor of his great majesty for, wait for it, 180 days. He throws a 6-month party at the palace, okay? And words like glory and majesty should tell you how he felt about himself and what it was he was trying to show. But you know what happens? A life that's focused on power is a life spent for something you can't secure, and it's something that doesn't last. So he's walking around with pride in his fame and pride in his power. You get down to verse 5, and you see pride in his fortune. Do you see the banquet lasted 7 days in verse 5? And then look at the end of it. From the greatest to the least, they were all running around the garden of the king's palace. No doubt Xerxes or Ahasuerus thought, I am an incredibly benevolent king. All the little people are even invited to my part. Isn't that lovely? And the problem with buying friends is they constantly need another payment to stay happy. And the bottom line is he's focusing on fortune and pride in his fortune. You get to verses 6 and 7, you see him putting pride in personal pleasure. Look at this, verse 6. There were hangings of fine white, violet linen, cords of purple, silver rings, marble columns. Look at verse 7. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty. Can you see this? You have a bunch of simple farmers and merchants walking through a palace with bleached linens, beautiful fabrics, cords, expensive purple, and they're going, ooh, ah. And then they serve them in these gold goblets, any one of which they would have liked to hijack under their toga and take home. And they're going, ooh, ah. And then they're dumping wine in it out the yazoo, and they're going, ooh, ah. And it's getting just louder in the place. There's laughing, there's music, some dancing of some scantily clad Persian women, and nothing is lacking, but nothing is real. It's not real. Focus on pleasure is a focus on the wrong world because it ends quickly. I think most people that have been on the planet for a while are surprised at how quickly it ends. Okay, if pride and that focus in the first part of the verse, in the first 7 verses, is a problem, so is poor perception. So the first thing they do in verse 8 is they drop the restraints. It says, drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion. That's the word onus, which is like the word onus in Latin, which means responsible burden. Nobody was responsible for their behavior as a result of the amount of wine. That's what it says. Well, there's a great idea. what we ought to do is legalize drunkenness, because that'll stop us from having to arrest people, right? It'll get jail time to a minimum. It just means you don't want to drive. And here's the thing. It says at the end of the verse that he should do according to the desires of each person. We're just going to let everybody work out what's good for the whole town, because that's going to work really well. The removal of restraints, though it makes you popular, is a disaster, and it leads to disaster. So right in the middle of that restraint being thrown off, there's deserted roles. Look at verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women, because while the king is having his banquet, the women are going to have a banquet too. And here's the problem. With day after day after day of the king attending to showing off and the queen attending to the women, here's what they're not doing. They're not attending to each other. Distance between them means that the possibility of bad communication is obvious. And it's interesting. It's possible to get so caught up in doing lesser roles that you don't do your most important role. Now, look at the diminished respect that comes out of the deserted roles in verse 10. By the king. It says in verse 11 that he was ordering to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. I think this king was really big on displays and pageants, but here's the bottom line. Could it be that parading your wife in front of a drunken palace is not the best idea to get people to respect her? I'm just saying. You can embarrass your spouse with anger and humiliation, but where do you go from there? And verse 12 says Queen Vashti refused. Shock of all shocks. She didn't want to come down there, walking the red carpet after they've all been fish-snickered pretty badly. So you end up in the end of verse 12 with this diluted reasoning, and I'm using the pun intentionally. It is diluted reasoning. And the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. Now, anybody who knows anything about how to make a mistake knows that anger is a bad guide to any destination but disaster. And he, out of anger, pulls in the third problem. See, he's got pride, then he's got a perception problem. Now he brings in problematic partners, a bunch of partners that are going to lead him in the wrong direction. And in verse 13, he puts out his personal problem in a mistaken forum. This is like settling an argument with your spouse on Facebook, okay? So what he does is, the king said to the wise men who understood the times, it was the custom of the king, so to speak, before all who knew law and justice, and he's going to tell them about his problem with his wife. Now, I'm just going to tell you that if you want to find a way to fix the problem, quiet down and get alone. If you want to blow it up, call the experts, because that's going to do it. Or make it public, because that's the help. I know of so many people that have repaired their marriage through the embarrassment method. No. Now, look at the misplaced trust that he puts in the people. It says that they call in these guys, and there's a whole laundry list of names, 7 princes of Persia and Media in verse 14, who had access to the king's presence, and they sat first place in the kingdom. Look, there's a special danger when you call in people and you're in power and you're asking their opinion, because their opinion might not be motivated by your best interest. So they come up with a mischaracterized problem. Look at it in verse 15. Because she did not obey King Ahasuerus, it looked down at verse 18, the day of the ladies of Persia, this day the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's conduct will speak in the same way to all of the king's princes. And there will be contempt and anger. The whole world is going to collapse because of what just happened. You know what happens? When people are asked for their advice, if they can make it sound worse than it is, they become indispensable. And what they're trying to do is ratchet up the problem. Is it really possible that every woman was going to lose respect because of what Vashti did at a drunken party? Very likely not. However, in their end, their characterization is based on less on facts than it is on the essential nature of them being involved. Now, you have pride, a problem of perception. Then you have wrong partners. And finally, you end up with a permanent pronouncement. And here's the end of the chapter in 119 through chapter 2, verse 1. What you don't want to do is quickly react in something that you can't take back. This is what I call the tattoo reaction. You don't want to get a tattoo across your face quickly, because you're not going to get it off. So here's what happens. In verse 19, it says that the laws of Persia and Media cannot be repealed. Issue an edict that can't be changed, that absolutely will be set in concrete. Oh, this is a good idea while you're mad. Verse 21, the word pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan had proposed. The great theologian, Elvis, reminds us, wise men say only fools rush in. It's worth remembering that it's better to sleep on what you planned than to stay awake on what you did. And it seems to me that the quick reaction led to lasting regret. So after these things, verse 1 of chapter 2 says the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided. He remembered Vashti and what he had done and decreed. Chapter 1 is a great belly flop of bad decision, set in pride with bad partners and bad perception and permanent solutions that are terrible. By the time you get to chapter 2 is entirely about pain. It's humiliation and news has come to Xerxes that he has lost. So when you see chapter 2, verse 1, and it says, after these things, that means after word got back that the Greeks have just kicked us out of their territory and handed us a sore defeat. After that thing, anger of Ahasuerus had subsided. He remembered Vashti. Well, of course he did. He had a lot of other things to be upset about, so he was less upset about her. And after the king's pain of regret came the king's redirection in verse 2. The king's attendants who served him said, I think what we ought to do is do a pageant. You're really big on pageants, O king. Let's do a pageant. Bring in beautiful young virgins to be sought for the king. In verse 4 it says, let the young lady who pleases the king become queen in place of Vashti. Now look closely at what they're telling him in the first 4 verses of chapter 2. They're saying physical beauty and sensual training are exactly what we need to pick a queen. Honestly, these guys sound like they could run a party in the United States. I mean, they're just finding people that you're going, what are you thinking? The world around him offered him anesthetic pleasures of redirection when what he needed were firm hands to help him get a steady stream forward. The rest of the chapter, the first 4 verses are about the king's pain, but the rest of the chapter is about Esther's pain. I want you to pick up on Esther's pain for a minute, because God brought her into the scene with pain that occurred even before you start seeing her role in the book. Look at verse 5. Chapter 2, verse 5 says that she was in Susa with a Jew who was Mordecai, who was an exile in verse 6 from Jerusalem. In other words, when we're introduced to her, she's already lost her family home. She's already lost her national honor. Second half of verse 6, she was living among the captives. She's already lost a nurturing environment in verse 7. Hadassah, that is Esther, had no father or mother, so she had already lost a family environment. So now she's down a family home, she's down national honor, she's down a nurturing environment. By the way, now she's lost her freedom. Go down to verse 8. Young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken into the king's palace, into the custody of Hegai. She has lost her freedom. She's now a part of something that, whether she likes it or not, she's going to be trained to pleasure a king. That's going to be her lot in life. By the way, the odds of getting picked to be the queen, pretty low. So this might be a real flame out of a career. And she lost all control. Look at that. In verse 14, down at the bottom, it says, in the evening she would go in, and then in the morning she would return to the second harem in the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch. This is a woman who has found herself outside of the nurturing love of a mother, outside of her hometown, outside of the place that would have been comfortable for her, and now dropped into a pageant that no woman in this place would have considered a comfortable environment for anybody. Before you go past this, chapter 2 is about pain. Just remember this: God understands pain. There are a great many things in God's divine providence that don't look like, to our eyes, goodness. But the fact of the matter is, faith sits before the mystery of something that's painful and accepts that God is good no matter how it looks right now. Faith patiently waits for God's revealing of an explanation in a later time. It doesn't put God on trial in the now. So Esther responded a couple of different ways. The rest of the chapter is about her response. Look, she follows with obedience. It says in verse 15, she came to go into the king. She built relationships. Look what it says. It says in verse 15, she did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. She saw God elevate her. She knew it wasn't her. Verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women. She understood by doing exactly what she was told and walking in obedience that she was elevated, and she trusted God's messenger. It's interesting. Do you notice that Mordecai is outside having sent her in? And in verse 20 it says, Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For, watch it, Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when she was under his care. This is a gal who trusts God's messenger and becomes God's tool. In verse 21 it says Mordecai was sitting at the gate, and there's a plot that unfolds in verse 22, and Mordecai is makes known the plot and actually gets the men taken care of so that they cannot harm the king. And virtually nothing happens to that story for a number of chapters. The point of chapter 2, God understands pain. And God can put you in an uncomfortable place, but God is working a plan. And it's well beyond what you can see, and often well outside of the area that you would consider a strong suit for you. Now, that's chapters 1 and 2, and it sets up Mordecai. It sets up Esther, or Hadassah. It sets up Xerxes, or Ahasuerus. And here's what I want you to know. By chapter 3 through 8, we begin now the actual unfolding of a plot. Chapter 3 and 4 are about Haman plotting to destroy the Jews when Mordecai finds out about the plot. Basically, in chapter 3, what you're looking at are two agendas that are in conflict. God was working a plan, and so was the enemy. There is a spiritual component behind the political and greedy politicians that are here. There is a spiritual component. So I want to see if you can see some of the key strategies on how it plays out with these two colliding one against the other. There's an armed spiritual conflict going on all around you. You were born into a spiritual battle. So was Esther. So was Mordecai. I want you to notice in chapter 3, verse 1, that the battle is a lot greater than we often tell, and the stakes are higher than we believe they are. It simply says that King Ahasuerus promoted this man by the name of Haman. He was the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and he advanced him, and he established his authority over the princes who were with him. Now, let me just say this. There are some corollary truths. The battle is greater than you think it is, and before there was a Hitler, there was a Haman. This is a man who is elevated on the surface politically, but spiritually for a purpose. In other words, he got a promotion and Satan signed off on it. I want you to also know that from the standpoint of the Bible, it is my belief that this battle that was going on behind had started generations before. If you go back to Exodus 17, you'll find out that when Israel had come out of Egypt and they were at a time of resting, they were attacked by a people called the Amalekites in Exodus 17:16. And the Lord said this, the Lord has sworn the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. Follow the line. In Deuteronomy 25, when they got to the edge of coming into the land, God said, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. Why am I talking about the Amalekites? Because Haman is an Agagi, and Agag was a king of the Amalekites. And this fight started long before the book of Esther. What's interesting to me is, do you remember the story in 1 Samuel 15? Saul was told, go and kill all the Amalekites, all their sheep, all their goats, all their camels, all the people. Who did he let survive? Agag, the king of the Amalekites, who continued to have his harem until finally you find Samuel coming and saying, Saul, did you kill them all? Why, yes, I killed them all. Then what is the bleating of sheep on yonder hill that I hear? Oh, well, I saved the best. But in the time period between the sacking of the Amalekites and the time where the prophet himself has to hack the king to death, a child is conceived. And there are Agagis that last all the way down into the book of Esther, who come back to destroy all of the children of Israel. Why? Because God said, I'll destroy all the children of Amalek. This is a winner-take-all fight. So when you step into this story, you don't realize it's been going on for generations. That literally, Haman was not coming into this story without satanic help and without a long-term revenge that's bigger than himself. Let me just say this in verses 2 through 6 of chapter 3, that the enemy's going to tip his hand. You're going to know it's the enemy because there's going to be unethical behavior involved here. It's going to be that verse 2 says that when Haman was at the king's gate, people would bow to pay homage. Mordecai wouldn't bow. Verse 5 says, Haman saw Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Haman was filled with rage. Verse 6 says that Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. Now stop right there. Does anybody else think that sounds like overkill? You won't bow to me, I will wipe your race from the earth. Does that sound like the way a normal person would respond? See, the basis of his actions weren't just evil, it was a hatred that came from the pit of hell itself. And the revenge orientation that went on here, the enemy resorts time after time to blaming a race to justify inhumane actions. And they do it on the basis of, they did it to us, like that's an excuse that works beyond a 2-year-old. Get down to verse 7 and you see another fact. The enemy is going to use self-made religious standards to convince workers that wrong is right. And it says down here that the lots were cast from Haman from day to day, month to month, until the 12th month. What's going on here? He's using a false religion, a casting of dice or lots, in order to decide when he should take action. Can I just say this? This false Zoroastrian predictive system had a little bit of help from the spiritual dark world. It wasn't just happenstance that had it fall where it fell. This guy's set in a position by something going on behind the scenes. This is bigger than you think. Now, very quickly, the rest of chapter 3, the enemy's fingerprints are all over the destructive work of what you're going to see. In verse 8, Haman said to Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the nations, and then he will characterize them without naming them. Verse 11, the king said to Haman, silver's yours, the people are also, do with them as you please. And the king's scribes are summoned. Verse 13 says letters were written to couriers, and verse 15 ends with the city of Susa was in confusion. You see it. The enemy throws these things and you see the bubbling of the confusion and the conspiracy going on. And in chapter 4, Mordecai learns of this and he tears his clothes in verse 1 and he begins to fast. Here's the bottom line. Behind the physical and political world is a spiritual world bubbling. It was going on before you were born. It'll be going on after you're gone. Here's the reality. There is a cosmic war and you're a part of it. Politics aren't all what they look like. Some people win and it has nothing to do with what's best for the country. It has to do with what the spiritual moves on the chessboard that are being played. You get to chapter 4, and here's the problem. A lot of us can live in a spiritual battle, but we live in the fog of physical comfort. So meanwhile, back in the palace in chapter 4, what we have is, you have Mordecai in verse 2 standing outside the king's gate in sackcloth. In verse 3 it says, each and every province there was great mourning. But what's interesting is inside the palace, they're not hearing any of that. See, the pleasured world, the comfortable world of blessing often insulates us from the tears and the problems that are going on around us. So in the fog, we can be dulled into our own comfort. So Esther's maidens came and told her that the queen writhed in great anguish, and she sent garments to clothe Mordecai when she finds out Mordecai is walking in sackcloth and ashes. But Esther doesn't know why. Why? Because she's living in the palace. Men and women, we can live right in the middle of a spiritual battle, and we're doing fine because we really didn't know there was a problem. And that's where she's living. What's interesting is she seems unaware of what's happening around her. Verse 6 says that Hathach went out to Mordecai and started to carry a message out. He also gave a copy of the text of the edict that he might show it to Esther and inform her in verse 8. So now it sounds like some words are starting to get in front of Esther. She's starting to understand that there's a problem. What's interesting to me is that instead of a radical response to the need, we can easily form our appropriate response. Mordecai says, look, we're going to die here. You got to do something. What are her words in verse 11? Well, you need to understand, I haven't been summoned before the king. It would be inappropriate for me to go. Mordecai's going, the place is on fire out here and you're worried about appropriate? Because what happens when we're distanced from the reality of the problem is we're thinking about what's going to, be appropriate, not what's absolutely necessary. Wild-eyed prophets abound to tell us to be sold out, but that sounds so extreme to the privileged child. And so here she is. Now what's interesting is it comes at the crossroad of the crisis. Esther had 12 months to prepare for her first meeting with the king. 6 months of oils, 6 months of perfumes. But the day she really needed to meet the king for her destiny, she had no time to think about it. And now was the time she calls and she says, she's struggling inside. Verse 13 of chapter 4, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you and the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place. That's the climax of the book right there. Get a clue, Missy. Things are going badly out here, and if you don't grab on, you're in trouble. Now, Esther was beautiful on the outside. That's established. But it wasn't until her eyes were open to the battle that we see the extent of her inner beauty. Esther gave a reply in verse 15. A change of heart was all that needed for her to engage God's will. Go, assemble the Jews, fast for me. Don't eat or drink night or day. If I perish, verse 16. Verse 17, Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded. It's interesting. Although the name of God is absent from the book, the fingerprints of God are all over her heart. So you get to chapter 5, and in chapters 5 and 6, you see her go and make a request. God's working behind the scenes to move Xerxes, to elevate Mordecai and expose the evil of Haman and this thing that's going to kill the Jews, this plot that's been formed against them. What's interesting to me is in the first 8 verses, Esther's request in chapter 5, then Haman's request is 9 through 14, and then God's intervention is the first part of chapter 6, 1 through 9. Look at how she comes. Her request was rooted in some latent recognition of God's control. In 4:14, it had already said, deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. That's what Mordecai told her. Get on board with doing this or God will have to use somebody else. There's obviously, in her sense of the situation, she's quivering a little bit over what she has to do. In chapter 5, verse 1, God required involvement, not distance. So Esther put on her royal robe and stood in the inner court. It's interesting because in verse 2, God expected caution, not presumption. And so it says Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter, but she took the time to get ready. She perceived how important her approach to the king to talk to him about this plot was. I think what's interesting to me is as I continue to read and say verses 3 and 4 of chapter 5, that God wanted a direct encounter, not oblique. Esther prudently wanted the enemy's man Haman to be in the room when she brings out all of this. So, what is your request, Esther? Verse 3. If it pleases the king, let him call Haman. It's interesting. She gets the king on board with helping her to get everybody in the room. And she gets him there in verse 5. Haman quickly came to do that we may do as Esther desires. What I think is interesting is that she is timing herself very well. Timing really is everything, and she delays her request until she sees whether the king is in fact on board with helping her. And I think that you see that in verses 6 through 8. Now look at verse 9. You get to Haman's request. Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart. You know what's interesting to me? Unbelievers live in the happiness of the now. Their whole life is about, is it going well? Are the circumstances good? I find that the world focuses on recognition. It's interesting. It says that he was so upset. Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and he did not stand up or tremble before him. Listen, you're having dinner with the king and queen. You'd think that'd be enough to get you going and get your juices going for the day. You got to have everybody stand when you walk through? Oh my. How many of you, like me, get sick of the ego battles with people? I mean, you're a world leader, for crying out loud. Get over your ego. What I think is interesting is that the world views success by the wrong standard. Haman comes in and he starts sharing with his wife what's happening. Even Esther, the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet. You know, the world measures success by wealth and celebrity and recognition. Those are all very short-term things. What I find interesting is God intervenes in chapter 6. And how does he do it? Esther has gone in. She's done everything she can. She's had a dinner with Haman. She's spending time with the king. She's trying to break the news to him, and she needs a little help. And God's hand to the unbelieving eye would look like coincidence. Meanwhile, God gives the king royal insomnia. And he works in the stillness. In verse 1, the king could not sleep. So he said, bring me some records. But not only that, God worked through surrender. Can you imagine this? God directs the hands of the servant right to the right bin with the right scroll of the right memory of what Mordecai had done years before. God had more weapons in his arsenal than the people could even perceive. So there in the middle of the night, the king says, what honor or dignity was bestowed on Mordecai because of what he did? You know what God works through? Your testimony. Mordecai had a long-standing testimony that didn't need to be paid back that day. And as a result, when God wanted to use him, he could pull the trigger on a testimony that was intact. It's interesting how God worked covertly. Nothing's been done for him. Well, the king's reaching his own conclusions, or is he? He's reaching his own conclusions when God set up his reading schedule in the middle of the night. He's reaching his own conclusions when God is hand-feeding him. Interestingly enough, too, God works through the enemy's mouth. If you go from chapter 6, verse 4, all the way down to verse 9, he sits down, the king sits down and has an interview with Haman and says, how do I honor somebody I really want to honor? And right out of Haman's mouth, he sets up what God is going to do for Mordecai, not for him. Well, you get to chapter 6, verse 10 through chapter 7, verse 10, and I want you to see something. God is working sovereignly because his arsenal includes orchestrated insomnia. It includes having the right books on the nightstand. It includes having the right people in the hallway. It includes dealing with the heart of an arrogant person to pronounce their own doom. God has all of these things ready at his disposal. Look at verse 11. 6:11 says, Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai. Here's what I want you to know. When you feel like you were abandoned by God, you weren't. When you think that counselors can be gathered together to hold back God's will, they can't. In verse 12, Haman hurried home in mourning with his head covered, recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that happened to him. Zeresh, his wife, says, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Guys, only a fool believes he can collect counsel against God. You can't do it. And the people that Haman collected together, including his wife, offered advice to build gallows before securing the king's permission for an execution. That seemed very prudent, and it was inherently wrong. Remember, there's a way that seems right to a man. What are the ends thereof? The ways of death. 6:14 says, if you think you will choose the time you're going to face God's judgment, you're wrong. It says at the end of verse 14, they hastily brought Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. One of the great ploys of the enemy is to convince people that they can somehow handle or control events that will keep them from harm. How do I know this? I used to do some counseling in a prison, and virtually everybody there thought they could get away with it. If you think you can talk your way out of judgment, by the way, chapter 7's for you. You can't. Verse 7 says, the king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed there to beg for his life from Queen Esther. Some people think they can talk their way out of everything. But here's the truth. If you think your actions to challenge God have been ignored, they have not. I'm reading chapter 7 at the end of verse 9. It says, the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Haman got his payment in this life, but that doesn't always happen, does it? Sometimes people do evil and it looks like they got away with it. I would remind you of Hebrews 9:27. It is appointed unto man once to die and then the judgment. I would remind you of Proverbs 14. There is a way which seems right to a man, but the end is the way of death. You can't discern spiritual realities by looking at the physical world alone. But if you look closely in chapters 6 and 7, you'll see God all over in the background pulling the strings from everything from insomnia to putting the right guy in the hallway. Now, as you move forward, take a look at Esther chapter 8, and what you'll find is that the plot against the Jews is turned into an opportunity for the advancement of God's people. There's going to be a turnabout happening in chapter 8, and then the celebration in chapter 9 and 10. And one of the things we have to learn when we open up chapter 8 is how to create conditions for God's blessing. And so you notice that chapter 8 verse 1 says, on that day. Well, when did God act on behalf of his people? It was only after Esther lived out practically what she was supposed to be living out and disclosed openly her identity. It's important for us to understand that when she identified with her people and she walked with a knowledge of what was their best good and kept that in mind, that she created a platform for God then to work through her. And God worked through the people when they worked together, when they decided to coordinate, because standing together builds strength and standing apart has little or no influence in its wake. Now, if you keep reading chapter 8, verse 1, you have to also understand the nature of God's blessing. So King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. And when you look at the verses in verse 1 and 2, you find out that God gave assets, God gave greater authority so that Mordecai could now come before the king. God gave influence of God's people, and all of that happened as he begins to turn the narrative to use what Haman plotted against the Jews in order to bless the Jewish people. In verse 2, it says that Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And it's interesting because Esther was given the choice as to how God was going to use the blessing and the giving of the assets. She was given the choice, and she put it in the hands of a mature one, Mordecai, because mature people will get out in front of the influence of what God's blessing is and help push it forward. She absolutely focuses on what God is doing and blessing the people. And if you read chapter 8, much of chapter 8, like verses 3, 4, 5, 6, she speaks to the king, she falls to his feet, she tries to avert the evil scheme, and she says, how can I endure, in verse 6, such a calamity that will befall my people? When God's people are given protection and position like Esther was given, that grace was extended to care for God's bigger agenda, and she helps and steps into that role. People are about to suffer calamity, and that gripped her heart, because you don't take action until the passion grips your heart for what God wants to do with his people. I noticed that in verses 7 and 8, there was also a sense of building up unity. The king turns and says, look, I gave you the house of Haman already to do what you want. Verse 8 says, now you write to the Jews as you see fit. And Esther steps into the role now of actually gathering the people in unity. The world doesn't have the ability to undo the moral messes it's creating by its fallen use of power. What she has the opportunity to do is get God's people united, because one string isn't strong, but many strings together make a cord. One nail isn't strong, but many melted together can make a mallet. And she's going to create a sense of unity. Look at the tools that they used. In chapter 8, verse 9, they used the king's scribes. They used Mordecai commanded in verse 9, the Jews, satraps, governors, princes. They did it according to their own language of all 127 provinces in verse 10. You see down in verse 13 that a copy of the edict was issued to all of the provinces, and that in verse 14 the couriers hastened and impelled the king's command. So they used the network of the connection tools that were already set up. They worked through the channels of existing leadership, and they did all that to bring about the blessing to God's people. The promises of God are backed by the person of God. And so what they were doing was taking those refuge statements that would help the Jews actually turn this thing around, and using the power of God to do it through the channels that were available. I would say at the very end of chapter 8, it's also worth noting that Mordecai, verse 15, went out in the presence of the king in the royal robes of blue and white. Verse 17 says, in every province, in each and every city where the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews. There was even dread for the Jews, that had fallen on the people. And you read the end of chapter 8 and you see that there's an outward show of honor, there's rejoicing of God's people, and there's respect for God's people. So he uses even the defeat of the world to advance his kingdom, but not until they were ready to stand together and take his promises seriously. We get to the final section of the book in chapters 9 and 10, and in that final section there's a remembrance. There's Purim, the word for lots. 8:15 to 17 already started this, the idea of a celebration. But there's a story that no one in this territories saw coming. No one in the 127 provinces expected to get word that Jews were going to be able to defend themselves in the story. And what's interesting is there was a con that went on in the mind of Haman and in the mind of people that wanted to do damage to God's people. The con that went on was they based their thinking on their own intelligence, and they thought that they could win. Evil could win. By the way, the same con exists today. There's a sense that evil is somehow winning in history. The enemy thinks he's in control, and he's so smart, he's outwitted the Creator. But chapter 9:1 all the way to 10:3 tell the story about a turnabout. Let me just give you very quickly a couple ideas about how that turnabout came about. And you begin in chapter 9, verse 1, and you see that God's patience will leave people believing it's not going to happen. So what you see is in 9:1 that the king's command and edict were about to be executed on the day when the enemy of the Jews hoped to gain a mastery over them, but it was turned to the contrary. God did a turnabout. What's interesting is, if you notice in the beginning of chapter 9, it's all the way into the 11th hour. It's all the way into the time when it's about to be executed, and God does this 11th hour solution. He waits until the end. And the important thing to remember is you don't believe that because God hasn't judged something yet, he won't judge it. God is incredibly patient. And his patience tricks those who don't believe his word into believing he's not going to judge. I would also remind you that the end of verse 1, it was turned to the contrary, is God's purposes will transform the landscape in profound ways. The word turned is a hafach. And hafach is actually the idea of a replacement or a turnabout. It's often associated with something that couldn't happen if God didn't step into it. Just remember that God is the one who can step into a situation and turn it. In verses 2 and 3 of chapter 9, I noticed that God's purposes were reflected when the people were in harmony and unity. And it's interesting because the Jews assembled in verse 2. No one could stand before them, end of verse 2. Those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews. It's interesting. When people came together, when God's people came together to do what looked like would be the best rescue for them, God then brought off the bench a team that was bigger than they knew was there. And all of a sudden, people began to defend them, even though they, a month before, would never have thought that way. I think it's important for us to understand that God brings resources that are unexpected to aid desperate people who are dependent on Him. You read the rest of chapter 9 and you'll see that God bestowed honor in verse 4 on Mordecai in the king's house, and that He struck all the enemies in verse 5. And that, notice in verses 5 through 16 that when the Jews got the chance, it says in verse 6 that the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men in Susa. Now notice in verse 10, they did not lay their hands on plunder. Verse 15, they did not lay their hands on plunder. Verse 16, they did not lay their hands on plunder. In other words, when God gave them the privilege to defend themselves, they didn't abuse the privilege and turn it around in a way that showed greed. And I think when you're wrapping up the end of chapter 9, you'll notice very carefully that God knows the exact terms for success in His objectives. So it's interesting. Verse 17 says that there was feasting and rejoicing. In verse 18, the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th, and the rest on the 15th. And so what you have is the establishment of Purim. Jews outside the capital had but one day of killing to secure their own people, and those in Susa had more time. And what you see is that God knew exactly what He was judging the success of the mission to be. Wrap up the end of the book, and here's what you'll see. That God will triumph, and His people will see His triumph clearly. He's going to bring about a victory, even though it's not going to look like He's bringing about a victory. Here's what I'm trying to say. This book ends with this stunning model. Evil will wax worse and worse. It'll look like they're winning, and then God will turn it about on the last hour. We should take and be heartened to a certain amount of solace from that. God is in the job of turning things that look like they're broken beyond repair and setting them aright. In my view, that'll happen when a trumpet sounds. In my view, that'll happen when the King comes to set people free. The nations will see Him. Let me just suggest to you that the book of Esther is God's salvation of the Jewish people, but it's also a template or a model for how evil can look like it's coming to its final fruition, and just at the hour it believes it has won, God will break through the clouds and change the conditions. The book of Esther.